Hey Matt, welcome.
Hi, let me get audio right.
Sure.
Hi, all. I apologize for running late, but I am so excited to talk. This is one of my absolute favorite topics, and I'm honored to spend some time with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here with us. So I will start with a quick intro for those who don't know you. Matt, you are co-founder and CEO at Sema, where you build engineering intelligence tools. I have to say that, first of all, I love how you define yourself on Twitter, on LinkedIn, as somebody who works at the intersection of technology and teams. And that really resonates with what refactoring is about, and also reminds me of the first event we ran together. That was one of the very first events in this community about giving good feedback. And I'm mentioning this because I think this is very relevant with respect to the topic that we are talking about today, which is instead accomplishment journals. So I know you have written a full white paper about this. I read it in full, took a lot of notes. I've come here well prepared, I have to say, but I will start with a very simple question just to break the ice. So what is an accomplishment journal in your opinion? Because many people get confused about this, and you'll hear many different definitions online about it.
Sure. And is my audio fine? Do I sound okay?
Yes, you sound perfect to me.
Wonderful. So the idea of an accomplishment journal, and I use it interchangeably with the brag book, is a way to keep track of, at a minimum, all the good things that are happening at work, and in an expanded way, situations that were less good but involved a lot of work. And we'll come back to that in a moment. In its core, an accomplishment journal should include every compliment that's meaningful that you have gotten, every piece of meaningful praise, whether that's a specific feedback from a senior leader, a performance review with specific comments, a rate like getting promoted is itself a compliment in that way. So there's
Yeah.
every a moment of praise that resonates. Everyone, when people say good job or looks good to me, right? It's not that, but specific moments that matter. And it includes stories where you have worked, where your work has translated into positive outcomes. And like I said, for folks who want to do the 2.0 version of this, work where you've done a lot of work and it hasn't worked is also can be useful, but maybe in its simplest form, it's just about a list of comprehensively of the compliments, and then also stories of that work that led to good things for the organization.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect definition. And it also resonates with my experience because I've been an engineering coach for a while, and I'm a big proponent of journaling at work and writing down things, as you said. And I think sometimes when people hear about either brag books or accomplishment journals, get tricked into thinking that you only have to write accomplishments, right? They come back to me and say, but this week I didn't have much going on, didn't I couldn't write any accomplishment, while instead you're saying it's not only about good things that you achieved, it's about lessons you have learned, it's about interesting situations from which you got something away, interesting conversations. So is that right?
Exactly. And if you haven't achieved, if you haven't led to something being different, so if you haven't achieved something in a month, I would actually start putting up some red flags that your boss isn't treating you right, you're not in the
Yeah.
right situation, because a month is certainly enough where your impact should be translating into something. And if you ever find yourself not being able to think of it at a month timeline, it's time to have a heart to heart with whatever's causing that and get to a better situation. Week by week, so all of my career choices are almost entirely based on, am I learning? Am I pushing myself? Am I growing? Not whether or not it's successful or not. So for me, if a week goes by and I haven't learned something, at least something small, that's a warning flag for me. We all might have our own different standards, but absolutely there should be something. If you're fortunate enough to be able to choose your situation, your professional situation, once a week, something that you did, something good that happened, something good that someone said to you, something you learned. Hopefully every week has at least one of those moments.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting angle because we are talking of pacing and rhythm here, right? What you're saying basically is that when we're talking of accomplishments, think in months maybe, but you should be able to write down something every week, probably something probably that you have learned, some good conversation that you have. When you think of people who successfully write accomplishment journals, like yourself maybe, what's the cadence? Is there a workflow that you do this every week in specific moments? How does it work for you?
I store messages in email when I'm getting messages that I want to keep track of. So I make a copy of them there. Compliments in Slack or other channels, I copy and paste into a notepad. So that's for the kudos side. And then I couldn't agree more. It's just a habit you have to get into. I use a habit tracker to and remind myself once a week I'm going to sit down and do some work on some of the keeping track of the larger moments that I want to record. If you are naturally inclined to following a schedule for things like that, amazing. Yes, Juan, it's hard to develop the habit. It's super, super hard.
Yeah.
Life, again, when you have the opportunities, life is a chance to just keep working on yourself. And sometimes you're working on substantive things like a new software language or a skill of giving and receiving feedback. But then sometimes it's meta skills that then help you do everything else. And the older I get, the more I value forcing myself to learn new habits as I think one of the most valuable meta skills there are. Because basically, if you do something, I don't know what the number is, something like 7 times in a row, maybe it's 14, maybe it's 20. Once you do it enough, you're then doing that thing. And we've all heard the stories about incremental progress. Just finding a way that works for you, and we're talking about journals, but it could be true for anything, to retrain your brain is so important. For me, seeing that I've made
Yeah.
progress or I haven't was motivational enough. In other sort of big moments, I've given myself a prize if I hit the goal. I like building Lego sets, so I've bought myself Lego sets if I've done something consistently. But one, I would say you're not alone in trying to get consistent. And maybe the obvious point, absolutely, positively block out a slot in your calendar and just do not override it. Have your calendar remind you of something like this at whatever cadence you're prepared to do. That's usually not always enough, but that to me that's a must-have. And do it at a time when you're at your most energetic, of what could be at night if you're a night owl or at the morning. But definitely step one is putting it in your calendar, and then step two is figuring out how you hold yourself accountable to it.
Yeah. I completely agree about building the habits, and it takes time. And as one said, it's hard to develop the habit, but I think the good things about habits is that once they're in place, they're even hard to kill because you're used to it. You feel bad if you don't do that. And just to make sure I understand, so you block time on your calendar, and this time is for reviewing what you have written throughout the week, for example, because I think there are like two main activities. You write down things that happen, and then every once in a while you reflect, maybe you go back, read through them, and try to make sense of things that happen. So, is this weekly
Yeah,
moment to write down things or to review?
you're scaring people with how attentive you are to self-improvement. So that's too high a bar to start with. To begin, Luca's a
Fair
gold
enough.
bar standard. Luca's a gold standard. If you write in your journal once a week for 15 minutes, just write for 15 minutes, and then once a quarter, buy yourself a fancy coffee and read it once a quarter, that is a huge victory over the status quo. At some point, you could get to writing for 15 minutes a day or a couple times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or whatever that looks like. But writing it once a week and reviewing it once a quarter is a really good place to start. Because if you have 3 insights a week, which is about likely the case, or 3 situations or something, you'll have 36 to look at after a quarter. And that is more than enough for any of the uses you might have for this.
Yeah, I love this. I agree. I agree. If you do it well, even if you do it sparsely, if you do it once a quarter, it's a huge win. I agree absolutely. And I ask a question that I remember also getting asked a lot by people I coached, by people in my company. That is basically one of the reasons why people don't write accomplishments down or accomplishment journal often is that they think their manager knows already. Okay, they think this is something that is useful for their career, for their manager to be aware of things that happened and good results by them. But they say, okay, but we have already good relationship, they know it better, etc. While instead, I think your career, your relationship with your manager is just one of the angles. So far, we have mostly talked about personal benefits. So my question is, what are the uses and the use cases for an accomplishment journal? Why you should write it, basically?
Yeah. Even if you have a really good relationship with your manager, you will have a better relationship with your manager if you come prepared to him or her with a list of accomplishments when it comes to annual evaluation time. Because there is no manager on earth who wouldn't benefit from someone giving them a list to choose from. I don't know if you've ever had someone write, you've needed a reference letter, certainly in graduate school when I did that. You write it for them and they get to fill it out at the end. And the success rate of people when you ghostwrite the reference letter, or at least start it, is a gazillion times harder because it's always easier to edit than it is to review. Number one of the many reasons, but only one, is the annual performance review process. Even if you don't have to contribute your part, if you're not part of an organization where you're supposed to contribute your own, you're sharing that list with your boss. Hey, sir, ma'am, I've just been keeping track and I know how busy you are.
Yeah,
I thought you might have a list for you to choose from. Because unless that person is keeping an accomplishment journal about each one of you, and almost none of them do because it's super busy, they usually don't take the time for it, it is helpful. So performance reviews is certainly one. But it's definitely only one of the benefits. Others include you will leave this job someday unless you're very unusual. And so having
yeah,
raw data for your resume, again, imagine you had one insight a week. Forget three, one insight a week. If your resume, depending on how you are in your career, will need 4 bullets a year, give or take. Goes a little bit less as you get more senior in your career. If you're doing one a week, you're going to have 50, assuming you take vacation, 50 to choose from to come up with the 4 bullets, that you need to describe what you did in that year. And it is human nature. It is so much easier to read than to remember. So much easier. That's
yeah,
why note taking and writing matters so much. So number 2 is for your resume. Number 3 is for your interviews. If you go to an organization that's even halfway competent about interviewing, they do situational interviews, which will say something like, tell me about a time when you succeeded. Tell me about a
yeah.
time when you worked on something hard, blah, blah, blah. And so having some of those moments ready to go through the accomplishment journal is a way to get ready for it. And then those are 2 reasons, and then 2 more, psychological and deeper, especially for folks earlier in their career. So reason number 4, fighting imposter syndrome. I've certainly had crappy days recently, but also over the course of my career, and just reading what my boss wrote to me or my boss's boss wrote to me is like a huge pick me up. When I remember this is
Yeah.
25 years ago, I remember the feedback that it was a voicemail, which is, how old it was. One of my bosses left me a voicemail of the work I had done on a project, and I kept it with me forever. It was, a jar of awesome. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Love the name, Jared Wilson.
You can beat yourself up. We all do beat ourselves up, but it's harder to beat yourself up when you have data that suggests at least sometimes you're doing a good job. And I really, especially early on, fighting imposter syndrome. So all of those are good, but absolutely miles and miles above any of these other reasons is it is fundamental for career planning. You need to have an ongoing conversation with yourself about who you are, what you like, and what you don't like. And you need to use that information to keep making better and better career choices, job choices that are better and better match for you. And I don't care. I don't care how many jobs you've had already or how good you think it is. You are not at the end of that journey. Even if you're in a great situation right now, your preferences will change over time. And if it's not a perfect situation now, then there is room to improve. The data matters so much. Remembering, I did this and it sucked. I did this and I was successful and I loved it, helps you understand the kinds of factors that help you plan your next job, the direction that you're heading in your career. We could do a whole other session on career planning, but just remembering those moments where, because as you write these journal entries, you don't actually have to write how you felt. You can if you want to, but you will remember. If it was important enough when you read it, emotional memory lasts forever, unlike the data.
Yeah.
And remembering it was a hard moment and a good moment could lead you to want to go find more of those. A hard moment and a bad moment could lead you to avoid those in the future. And I so deeply, the only person who's really ever going to really be able to manage your career is you. The only one, because no one is able to understand you well enough. No one else has your best interests at heart. And so other people can help, but you and your data about your lived experience is
Yeah.
fundamental for planning what you do and the projects you take on and the work that you do next.
I love this take because much of the advice you hear and read about career planning is about if you do this, if you get good impact outcome, you get promoted in X years, or you have to switch companies to learn more, etc., etc. But there isn't much advice that actually says stop in your tracks and think, how did it feel to do that? Things that felt right, felt good for you, you enjoyed them, as opposed to these other thing that really sucked. Because there are different jobs in tech, very different roles, and sometimes even what you're good at is different from what you to make things even more complex. And I think this element of self-reflection, writing down how you felt in a given moment, is extremely useful to come back and really get together with your feelings and what you really want to
Exactly.
do.
Exactly right. And so we'll have one addition, a tiny amount of homework, but man, you will thank me for it. Trust me. Spend 5 minutes, create a grid, allocate 100 points, and allocate what is leading to your life satisfaction today.
Yeah,
And if that includes detail on your work, fine. But otherwise, then create a separate table of the 100. Then do work satisfaction out of 100 points. Then do whatever that number is. Let's say it's 25 out of the 100. Then do a breakout on work satisfaction and write out the components and those numbers. You don't have to do anything else with it. That's going to take 5 minutes and put it away. But 3 months and 6 months and 12 months from now, read that again and see if it's still true. Because the first time you do it, we're usually wildly off. We don't like, hey, what matters to you? I want to make enough money, or I want to make a lot of money, or whatever. Like money, it's just an end, right? It's usually not the
yeah,
thing itself. And so but sometimes we're saving up for something, right? Is it money? Is it the presence or absence of a boss who is supportive, or not, or the presence of a boss who is not supportive? Is it the challenge of the work? Is it being a leader versus an individual contributor versus a manager of people? Is it the pace of the business? And just collecting that data about yourself, because one, we don't know ourselves very well, and two, as Lucas said, our preferences change. It's such a cool exercise, and it helps you get closer and closer to the thing you should be doing in that moment, which is incredibly individualized to you, and you are the person who can know yourself the best.
yeah, absolutely. And I want to say to TJ, yes, we will do a career planning session now that you ask. So duly noted. And I wanted to add that sometimes people think, okay, but to make this effective, I have to write down a lot of things, a lot of details about stuff that happened. But I don't feel that's true because feelings really stick with people. So even if you write down small bits about an event, when you read them back, you are able to recollect, you remember. So I think of notes as anchors for your memory to get back to some moments, and you really don't need to write much. So you can really spend little time to jot down the core things, and you should trust yourself that when you read them back, you will remember the full thing. I
Totally.
think
So
that's for me.
yeah. Minimum viable journaling, if we can steal a phrase. If it's hard for you, set the smallest amount of time that you're really sure you can do. Let's have it be 5 minutes and just write for
Yeah,
5 minutes uninterrupted. No filtering. Of course, we can talk about more of what's in an accomplishment journal, but it is totally private. You can use it later for polishing. Write as fast as you can what's in your head. And after 5 minutes, be done. If you think you can do it for 10 minutes, fine, but 5 minutes is enough. I think it's People have said it at different points in time, but I think it was Toni Morrison, the famous American author. People forget what you told them. They forget what you've taught them, but they never forget how they made you feel. I butchered it slightly, but like emotional memory lasts
No,
forever.
no,
And so if you wrote Matt Luca session, it's enough, man. You'll remember it. You'll remember how you felt about it. And so it's just building the muscle memory to do it just a little bit, but a little bit on a regular basis.
I agree, and I don't think you butchered it at all. I think you were perfectly on point. So, speaking then about such a minimum viable journaling, such a minimum viable accomplishment journal, what goes into that? Do you have, I know you have formats and ways of writing down things that you believe work well for you. So, tell us more
Yeah.
about it.
So if you only can do 5 minutes, just write whatever's on your mind. What happened? What did I do? And what happened? That's good enough. But if you have a little bit more time, there are a few structures that work. And I know, Luca, I think you're going to repost. I built some templates that
Yeah.
people should feel free to use and modify. I think I'm going to talk about the logic model, which is, I think, my favorite. And then I want to do a deep dive into outcomes in particular. And then we'll talk about another option of a newspaper article. So a logic model is a way of teasing out causality in a situation, doing your best to understand why something happened. I actually came about it. I was a student in the social sciences. And so sometimes as a way to understand how communities change, it works, but I actually think it works. The logic model is a really nice framework for an accomplishment journal as well. 4 parts to this. So you could create a table. Resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And what you would do is any given moment, if you were working on an epic, if you were taking on a leadership role of coaching somebody or becoming a manager, that is a moment, that's a row, and the columns have these 4 elements. So resources is how much time, and this is about you, so this is a logic model for you, how much time did you spend on it? Sometimes it's about money, but usually in the work context, it's about time. Activities is what you did, and here trying to be really specific, as specific as you can would be super helpful. Over the last, it doesn't have to be exact, but let's say over the last month, I worked on a sprint to build I was the head web developer, excuse me, to build our next customer facing dashboard. I worked about 30 hours a week times 4 weeks. And that's resources. And then, of course, there were resources helping me. So there were other people. But in total, I did about 70% of the work and other people did the other 30. So putting your resources in context. The activity was I went back and checked and I did, say, 50 epics with 200 line file changes. The good news is you're usually working in a system that might have that kind of data. If not, you can approximate it as good enough, whatever you remember in that moment. And then we get to outputs and outcomes. And different people do it differently, but my way is right. So I'll just save you some time. The difference between an output and an outcome is an outcome is on a very short list of the things that matter most. Is what happened. They're both about what happens, but outcomes is forced a tiny number that matter as much as possible. And anything else that happened but doesn't matter as much as an outcome goes into an output. And so that is all art and science and experience and judgment to figure out what is an output versus an outcome. But it's forcing yourself to think about what is really mattering in this moment. So that's part 1. Part 2, as promised, I want to talk to you about a hierarchy of outcomes because some outcomes matter more than others. The most important kind of outcome is objective reality results. And so if you're building a new web application, user growth, user adoption, any of the metrics that your business is using count as part of this. What is different in the real world because of you? If you are keeping a journal, if you're entering a journal entry about being a manager, an objective reality result could be members of your team got promoted, got raises. That is something that exists in the world that didn't exist before. So it's a real thing. Objective reality is number one. Number two is subjective opinions of people who matter a lot. And again, what does matter a lot means? It varies. Generally speaking, the more senior, the more it matters, as long as they actually are in a position to evaluate. So an SVP of engineering who's, let's say, 2 levels up from you, who actually knows enough about the detail to say, wow, that website was really well designed. It's one of the best I've seen. That is a subjective opinion of someone who has real weight or influence. CEO writing, I'll pick on CEOs for a moment. CEO writing is saying, I love the new colors of the new website. It doesn't really matter because it's not, even though that person has more subjective and has more authority, whatever, they're not in a position to really evaluate it,
Yeah.
So subjective opinions of people who with particular weight, influence, or knowledge is number two. Number three, subjective opinions of people who have less weight or influence, but again, are able to be close. So that's someone who's not quite as important, not in a spiritual sense, but in a like real world, so what sense. It could be peers, it could be people reporting to you, categories are like that. And the least important when it comes to external uses of the accomplishment journal, you see where I'm going this in a second, like promotions, like your resume, interviewing. But the most important for imposter syndrome and career planning is your own subjective opinion. How did you feel about it? How do you think it went? What is your assessment? And I think one of the hardest things on earth, and organizations and people are so bad at disentangling how much time did I put into it? What actually, actions were taken? Because there's people who like think about things all the time, but aren't actually acting. And so when you actually get to the action, that's very different from, in theory, the resources allocated. And then as humans, we're not good at disaggregating what is an outcome that matters versus what is an outcome that does not. Of course, I also really believe organizations should use this, but right now we're talking about you and your own journaling. Really get yourself in the habit of saying what really happened as a result. And that as much, and it's really at most 2 or 3 things per moment. And when we're talking about the accomplishment journal on the professional side, the closer it is to the department's goal, the division's goal, the company's goal, the better, as long as your actions had a meaningful impact on that outcome. If plenty of examples, but if your product if you're working on an existing feature, if you're making an existing feature better, you probably can't take credit for revenue growth unless the team knows that people, because they were looking on that feature, were made a difference. And working on an existing feature certainly helps with retention, right? So you can say, we fixed this, we made it better, and as a result, our NPS went from lower number to a higher number. We kept those customers. But of course, implicit in all this is there is causality, and use whatever mental model, whatever mental trick you need to think about, does someone believe this? Maybe there's a person in your mind who's pretty skeptical, and ask yourself, would they buy this connection? I personally delivered 100% of all of our new revenue growth based on my work on this. Was a skeptical person believe that? If not, answer it in a way that a skeptical person would believe. And that is not a cynic, but a skeptic. That's a good way to think about what fits in the outcomes.
There is a lot to unpack here. I took notes while you were speaking. I think one of the most interesting things here is about the hierarchy of that not all feedback or praise or opinion matter equally. And when you talk of influence, I love that you don't just refer to the level of the person, but also how close to the action they are. If the boss of your boss gives you vogue praise about something like the color of a button and they were not involved at all in the project, of course that matters less than specific pointed feedback by somebody who worked with you on that all the time maybe. And I also love that you put yourself last, basically. But I think there's important distinction because we said at the beginning, your feelings matter a lot, right? How people, how situations made you feel, it's important. You have to remember that. But at the same time, your judgment about a situation might be biased. So better not to rely on that too much. Is that correct?
Exactly. And this is the two different parts of the two different parts. Juan, I see your question. I'll answer it now. Next. The two different use cases are very different. Where you're using the results for external purposes, advancement, interviewing, etc., then the objective reality matters a lot. Where it's for your personal growth, your personal career planning, the subjective assessment matters. And there's no such thing as inaccurate or not. It is just how you felt is how you felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, full stop. So Juan, you asked what can go into outputs. Again, we're going to keep this as easy for you to do, like minimum viable. And if you want to do more, you can do more. We're still just building a list of items. We're just writing on a piece of paper. So you don't have to collect documents or anything like that. It is, an example might be, an example could be, I wrote 100,000 lines of code as an activity. I had pushed 50 pull requests, made 50 pull requests. We had 4 releases. 4 releases is an output because nobody cares, except that those releases turned into, a vanity metric. All right, I'm going to go a second on metrics for a second, so humor me. Nobody cares except that it turned into a product that led to usage growth, that led to sales growth, that led to retention. That, again, we're speaking in the business of software. There could be many other examples. On metrics, so there is a vanity metric, which is, it really doesn't matter. It just makes you feel good about yourself, perhaps, but it doesn't have an outcome. There's also something called a busy bee metric, and that one actually matters a little. And a busy bee metric is facts, it's quantitative facts about what was going on, and those are so important to put into your resume and also have available for interviews. So to the extent you're using this for interviewing and for resumes, keeping track of those facts really matters because it gives so much more context. One of the first things I do when I'm reading a resume is look for numbers because it puts it in context and it shows that this person has numeracy, a general sense of how math works. And so it is actually useful to know. And so when I said nobody cares about how many releases, when you're telling the story about the work you did, having that be an anecdote. So, sorry, what does busy bee mean? There's an expression, busy as a bee. If you were going into an interview, Luca, I want to tell you about the work I did at Company X building this corporate website, the next version of our dashboard. I worked 120 hours on it. Along the way, I did 1,000 file changes, 50 commits. I led four releases. And let me tell you what happened. What happened is we got user growth. You shouldn't skip that interim part because a code base of that size with that many pull requests, with that many releases, gives Luca a chance to put this in context. Was it a single release? A product that had a single release is going to be very different from a product with 20 releases. It was a little bit unfair. We care a little, which is why we keep track of those outputs so that we can have some more, give some more meat, some more substance to when we're telling the story to others. You don't need it for your own sake, but again, for these external purposes. And so busy bee metrics are more important than vanity metrics, a very long story.
I think that's a great distinction. By the way, Matt, I hear you and I see you fine, but I see my video with some delay. I hope you all hear me well, but if something sketchy happens, feel free to tell me or write in chat. Anyway, yes, because I love the distinction because sometimes we think metrics and outcomes are like black or white. That is, there are things that don't matter at all and things that are the only important things, while and I think one of the things that I don't like about the word itself, vanity metrics, is that it makes it seem like there are good metrics and there are metrics that are totally useless or just for vanity, while it's more of a spectrum in reality, right? It's not like saying that you did 4 releases and wrote like 10,000 lines of code doesn't matter at all. It matters, but less than, let's say, the business outcome, the value for the user, and so on. I love the way you separate between outcome and output. And while you were speaking, about talking about feelings and subjectivity, objectivity. I remember also one of the advice you told me about feedback and the fact that expressing your feelings, as counterintuitive as it seems, is always objective. Feelings are objective because they are your own, right? So when you write down how you feel, you are writing down something that cannot be countered or objected by anybody because that's your own, as opposed to giving the judgment over some situation which can be instead subjective. So sometimes the better framing of a situation is just saying, this situation made me feel this way, and then have a conversation about it.
I couldn't agree more. I'll share just a quick anecdote. I started a job many years ago at a extremely high performing organization, a really outstanding one. And I showed up and I loved the people, very smart, great at what they did, cared so deeply about the mission. I showed up on the first day and I was so surprised at how quiet it was. It literally was such a quiet office. And it was so shocking to me. I had this reaction and I'd never been in a place that quiet. And I was so surprised. And it was a very confusing reaction. And I wrote about it. And it was so shocking. I was never going to forget it. But I wrote about it and reflected on it. And I realized that it was not a positive surprise, nothing to do with the organization or its outcomes or its people who are all spectacular, but it really didn't click with me. And it took me far longer than I would have liked to remember, to understand that there was a really central truth in that, which is, for me, I am only happy at work in certain organizational situations. And humor me, we'll go a little bit deeper, again, a little bit into career planning. Companies can be at the baby stage, going from 0 to 1. They can be in the rapid growth from 1 to 8. They can be at greatness and are sticking around greatness, so they're somewhere between 8 and 10 and trying to stay there. Or they can previously have been great and trying to get back up to it. And they're a 3 now, but they used to be a 10. Those 4 situations, beginning, rapid growth, greatness and staying great, or turnaround, are fundamentally different, feel fundamentally different, regardless of the industry, regardless of your job. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who is happy in more than two of those situations. And the organization I joined was in that third category, was in excellence and continuing to provide excellence. And it was just not the right fit for me. And I had no idea. It took me a long time to process that, but it all started with, I'm so confused at how quiet this place is. What are we like? And the answer was, in this case, if you're to be excellent means some really careful reflection and making sure you're not making any mistakes, and doing a small number of things extremely well, not scrappy, but really right. And it turns out that's not me. I'm a super scrappy person by nature, and I'm much happier in a messier situation. It's where I am the happiest and I do my best work. There is no right answer about that. There's no judgment, good or bad, about that, but it is true how it made me feel. I was super confused about how quiet it was, and that turned out to have nothing to do with the organization and everything to do with me and what I felt about it.
That's a great story. And I think that's also what makes the job of a founder of a scaling company so hard, because it's like at different stages, you have different jobs. And what it takes to do a good job in one of the stages is fundamentally different from the other stages. And there are people and it's hard to find people who are good and enjoy all of the stages. So you might figure out that you are more of a 0 to 1 person rather than a scale up person who is taking the one and bringing it to the next. And I think it takes time because it gets into your mind. I'm a former founder, so it gets in your mind that you think you should enjoy this. I should enjoy this more. I used to enjoy this. Maybe I have changed. Maybe I'm tired. But it is simply sometimes that the situation, the context has changed. And so you figure out that something is not good for your career, is not good because it's not good for you, for how you are shaped simply as a human being. But I think it takes time. I don't know if it was a process for you that took time to figure out these things about yourself, what you're the most comfortable with, but it took time for me.
Took forever. I'm still learning. Every time you think you've learned yourself pretty well, you change or you realize there was something about yourself you didn't know. Like habits, learning how to develop habits, this is something that you just have to get better and better at over time of learning, understanding yourself. And there is no substitute for continuing to learn. My preferences now are quite different from my preferences 10 years ago and 20 years ago. I like to think I'm better at realizing what those preferences are. And it's not, I got better at learning my preferences, but also my preferences absolutely have changed. And I like to think that the window between my preferences changing and me recognizing that my preferences have changed is much smaller than when I was younger and I didn't have the experience and the tools to interpret my own reactions.
Yeah, that's the same for me. I feel like I have a tighter feedback loop with myself. I'm more
Exactly.
self-aware, so
Exactly.
maybe I have less energy. Things change, but one thing I know for sure is that it's like I'm more aware of things that happen around me that make me feel in some way or another way. So maybe it's the gray hair, the byproduct of that. But yeah, it's the same for me. So, guys, I know we are running out of time. We have 10 minutes left. Does anybody have questions for Matt? Otherwise, I have a ton myself and I can go on and on, but just want to give somebody opportunity to ask for something because Joanne asked examples of output. I think Matt gave them early on. So, are there any other questions?
Mine, so what does my journal look like? So it is private. So no, you can't see it, but Luca is going to share some templates
Yeah.
that come really close. Pick the tooling that is your favorite. I cannot stress enough. If you like paper and pencil or pen, use that. If you like Notion, use that. If you like Excel, use that. Google Sheets, whatever. You need to remove the friction from doing this because there's friction and there's always excuses. You can always think of something else to do. So pick your favorite method. For me, it is Excel. I was trained on Excel early in my days, and it's still my favorite tool no matter what. And so it really is a set of columns and rows. And I use there's another method, the newspaper article style, which also needs a series of columns. And that's imagine you're telling a story, writing a newspaper article. And so you want to cover who was involved, what was the problem. You can also think of it as like a screenplay. What happened, what made it hard, what did you do? Because this is about you. This is about you, excuse me. And then what happened? So talking about the outputs and outcomes. But for me, it really is a numbered list. You always have a unique ID if it's in Excel or Google Sheets. A brief name, slightly more description, although you're not likely to forget it. But if the short name is too short, you might want to add a little bit of detail. And then minimum viable number of columns, resources, activities, output, outcomes, or who was involved, what was the problem, what made it hard. This is the newspaper article style, which Luca will share. What did you do versus others? Because remember, for both purposes, how you feel and then also how people interpret it is about your contribution to that situation. So make sure, and it's private, so don't worry about bragging. Be accurate about what your contribution was, and then talk about the result.
I think that's great advice. For what it's worth, I also noticed that usually when you're starting a new thing and you're wondering what is the best tool for doing that, because we are engineers and we all ask ourselves such questions, usually the right answer is the tools you already use. Because winning the friction for something that you're not sure you will be able to keep consistency with is the most important thing. Then once you have built the habit, I would say you can optimize how much you want. But first, the goal is win the friction and win the habit.
Said.
So I see another question from Juan. I read it out loud. Writing this kind of journal is long-term investment. It's difficult to put the effort on this because you don't see the benefit quickly. And then you regret when you have to present the highlights for the mid-year review with your manager. So any tip for overcoming this, for overcoming the bias of the long-term investment?
Yeah, it's very real. I think it just speaks to it's such an individualized decision. If you've taken the necessary background steps, 10 minutes a week, 10 minutes a week, put it on your calendar. Use tools that are as easy and delightful as possible for you to use. I would probably write down why you're doing it. So have a North Star of your goals, what you hope to achieve. So you force yourself to look at it when it's that time on the calendar. I'm doing this because blah, blah, blah. And then it's what in your life have you worked on that is hard for you to do, but you did it anyway because it was in your long-term best interests. And I think we all have different kinds of discipline. We're not all
Yeah.
disciplined about the same things. So what has moved you? Went through a period of time where I wasn't exercising, and what got me back on track, the immediate thing that got me back on track were two things. I kept a tracker to see if I was doing it, and I'm the kind of person who wanted a certain number of check marks, and I was getting I was just feeling better day by day, and that reminder of it feeling better. But third, I did it every day or 6 days out of 7. There's something about enough repetition for me to make it more likely that I'm gonna do it regularly. And so I it may be the case that instead of doing 10 minutes a week, you do 10 minutes a day. I'm not opposed to that. It's just sometimes a little bit of reflection on what happened is better to get to the right level of aggregation, because
Mhm.
these are stories about the arc of a project, and the arc of a project isn't going to happen in a day. That's why if you want to journal for your own sake, I'm super supportive of it. But this accomplishment journal is there's scenes in a movie, and you're capturing the scene, and you're not capturing the line of dialogue, you're capturing the scene. And so I guess I'd think about when in my life have I successfully adopted a habit, and what can I learn from that? And frankly, if you don't have anything like that, then just use this as a chance to practice that skill. Can you bribe yourself? Does that work? Can you write about it? Can you find a buddy who will hold you accountable, who might be doing it with you or not doing it with you? And work your way through the list of build that toolkit of, okay, because you're going to, the rest of your life, personally, professionally, in your personal relationships, in your health, your well-being, you need to find a way to change yourself for your own good and for your relationships with others. So if you don't have those methods now, it's okay. They're hard, man. Just try them. Keep a journal about tactics and see which of those stick.
I think that's a perfect response that applies to so many situations. Some of them you have mentioned already, like exercising, not just writing an accomplishment journal. When you do it regularly, I think you will find some usage even in other situations because I can make you some examples for to prepare for one-on-ones. When you are a report and you're about to have a one-on-one with your manager, sometimes you just think back at things that happened and you have to come up with things to say, right? To discuss in the one-on-one, and the journal is useful to come back to those or to prepare for retrospectives or team meetings where you have to give feedback and to discuss feedback that has been received. I think that journaling in a broad scope, not just about, as we have said, accomplishments, but about lessons learned, finds usage once you're doing it regularly, even in the short to mid term. You don't have to wait by the semester performance review to get the payback, I think.
Well said.
So, guys, thank you again for being here. Thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. It was a pleasure and a great speech.
My pleasure. I love the questions. Luca, I think so highly of you, and I love the refactoring community. I'm so proud of what you've built, and it's a thrill. It's a thrill to talk about this. I wish you all huge success as you figure yourself out and figure out ways to learn who you are and what you want. It is one of the hardest, maybe the hardest thing you'll ever do, and you'll just have to keep working on it until you're dead. How's that? I don't mean in a negative way. It's just an ongoing journey to learn, like it's exactly as Luca said, to shorten that feedback loop, to learn about yourself and act on it in according with who you are and what you want. So thank you. I wish you all well. Have a great weekend, and I know we'll be in touch.
I cannot add anything. These were the best parting words of, I think, any event we have ever had. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Matt, for supporting us from day one, really. And see you soon. I will post this in the community, the full recording. I will create a dedicated newsletter edition, as Matt said, about accomplishment journals and all things we have discussed. Thank you,
Amazing.
everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.